County. The League is proud to be nonpartisan, neither opposing or supporting candidates or political parties at any level of government. For 100 years, we've worked hard to make sure voters are heard at the ballot box. And today we're delighted to have Derek Donovan from the Kansas City Star here to help us make our voices heard in other forms like the newspaper. So this is our plan for today. We're just going to go over a few Zoom tips, and then we're just going to Derek is going to just take your questions and we'll just kind of have a dialogue. And then we'll close with a few announcements, and we'll close at noon. And to help everything run smoothly, let's just go over a few things. We are recording this and we will post it to YouTube in a few days. So we have two ways that you can ask questions. You can either use the chat box and write in there, or you can use the raise hand feature, and then we'll call on you and then you can unmute and ask your question yourself. We do recommend, after I stop sharing my screen, that you use the gallery view, and you can switch the layout on your screen by clicking view in the top right corner and selecting gallery. Just a reminder to keep your comments respectful and nonpartisan. And also we've enabled closed captioning, so you can use that if you want. And then this screen just shows kind of where some of those controls are: the mute button, and the video button and the chat button. The raise hand feature may look like that, or it could be in your reactions. If you click on reactions at the bottom, and you'll see it there. So, okay, so I'm delighted to introduce Janet Milkovich, our moderator today. Janet is vice president of our league and has become our go-to moderator because she does such a wonderful job. She recently retired after spending more than 20 years in the nonprofit sector, and her husband and she just returned to the Kansas City area a few years ago, and she has jumped in with both feet and become incredibly involved in the community, both in the league and then outside of the league. So Janet, thank you. I'll turn it over to you and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Amber. Welcome, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces here. It's so good to see you. Hey, Judy. Good to see you. I'd like to introduce Derek Donovan. Derek has worked for the Kansas City Star for 25 years, beginning as this is the hardest word, Derek, that you gave me, beginning as an ombudsman. Did I say it right? I put it in there phonetically, but it's really a hard word. But beginning as an ombudsman, he was the director of research and information, and for the past 4 years has served as the community engagement editor. Derek is also a member of the editorial board. So today's format, we're going to do questions and answers, and I'm going to begin with a few questions that have already been submitted. And then Derek really welcomes your questions and comments as we proceed. Are you ready, Derek?
Yes.
All right. So one question, as community engagement editor, I read that you strive for a good mix of letters, columns, regional syndicated, and local op-eds. What's the difference between a letter and a column?
So at the Star, we have two different opportunities for contributions from people in the community, and those would be the guest commentaries that I run 3 to 4 of per week normally, and the letters to the editor, of which I run between 4 and 7 every day. The letters are 200 words or fewer, and they are on a wide variety of topics. And you'll notice if you read our letters that I do local and national and international topics in the letters. Guest commentaries run to about the 600 to 650 word length. They have to be generally by somebody in the area, and almost 100% exclusively have to be about a local topic. If you looked back in previous years of the Star, you would see that we used to run guest commentaries on a wide variety of topics. However, our mission has been in recent years to make sure that everything that we run needs to be germane to Kansas City and needs to be special to Kansas City. You know, everybody in the world has an opinion about national and international topics. And really, to be honest, I don't particularly care that much about about using my space to publish something from somebody in the Kansas City region talking about national, international topics. There's plenty of commentary about that. And part of that is because the world has opened up so much in the era of cable news and especially the internet. Everybody can comment on anything that's going on around the world. And one of the things that is most unusual about where we are today compared to where we were 30 years ago is that the national dialogue and the international dialogue has centered on those things that everybody shares. And so we're just inundated with national and international news these days. But what's interesting to me and what's of special interest that we can offer to our readers is things about Kansas City and things about Missouri and things about Kansas that CNN is not going to talk about, Fox News is not going to talk about. And so that's why I want to try to center the conversation in my pages much more about things that are of local interest, that are unique to people who read the Star, and to give them a reason to come to the Star. Because if I just spend all of my time talking about national or international news, that's no different than what people can get elsewhere. And so I think that making the conversations all come back to things that we uniquely share in Kansas City and that we know about is of much more interest and value to our readers, and also at the same time informs our voters a lot more. We are much better using our time much better if we are talking about what Laura Kelly and Mike Parson and Quentin Lucas and Ed Eilert are doing than if I'm talking about what Joe Biden or Mitch McConnell are doing. So I just think it's a way better use of our time and our resources to be focusing the conversation on the Kansas City region.
And I think you referred to that as hyper-local, right?
Hyper-local, yeah, that's a great term.
So, to narrow that down a little bit, some of the speakers we've had in the past had said we really need to pay attention to politicians on a local level because the city and county commissioner and state politicians are the ones that make decisions that really impact our daily life. And to equate that to what you're saying, you're looking for letters to the editor to do something similar. Would that be accurate?
That's extraordinarily accurate. And I'm going to build on that a little bit. I think the most underappreciated political topic in American life is state legislatures. The people that we elect to the state level have an extraordinarily large impact on our day-to-day lives. And I bet you that there are very few people proportionally who even know who their state legislators are, much less what their political orientations are. And it's at the state level where many, many things are done that affect our civic lives. And the best example I can point to is what's gone on in Missouri over the past 2 years or so. The voters overwhelmingly approved Clean Missouri a couple years ago. And then this last November, legislators put what, and I'm going to make my personal opinion here known, put an extremely confusingly worded initiative on the ballot that largely reversed Clean Missouri. Clean Missouri was overwhelmingly approved and then fairly narrowly overturned with a ballot initiative that put at the top a very milquetoast ethics reform that overturned the most important parts of Clean Missouri. So at the state level, lawmakers are doing a very coordinated effort to thwart the will of the voters in a lot of states right now. And then the Clean Missouri is the best example of that I've seen in recent years. And because it is very difficult for the everyday voter to stay on top of that kind of thing, it's why engaged citizens need to keep these issues at the front of everybody's mind. I think it was Andrew Sullivan, the conservative commentator, who said a few years ago that the genius of liberal democracy is that it doesn't make everyday people have to spend that much time thinking about it. And that's true. But at the same time, one of the biggest side effects of the fact that the cable news networks and the internet have made everything about the national and international level in recent years is that people get really caught up in what's going on sort of at the top, and they don't pay enough attention to what's going on at the civic and the state level. And that is a big problem.
That's a good advertisement, Derek, for the League of Women Voters.
That's right.
We have membership of more than 300 men and women that really do focus on issues at hand here in our own community. So thank you. We got a question from one of our participants. They're wondering if the letter to the editor section is different in the digital version and in the print version.
I have the ability to do that. I don't very often do a lot of that because, and I'm going to just be very honest with you, the letters are extraordinarily popular in print, and we have a lot of metrics that show how much people read them online, and they don't have as much readership online. So a lot of what we do in the newspaper industry is balance the amount of labor that we put into the print product versus the digital product. And the things that get a lot of readership online, I spend a lot of time working on. The things that don't get that much readership online just quite frankly aren't worth that much time. So, I could, if I wanted, I could publish more letters online because I get a lot more letters than I have time for in print. I don't generally do that all that often, just because the thing is, the comments and particularly Twitter are like the digital letters to the editor. And so people just don't look to kansascity.com for that much user content. That is much more of a print play for me.
One thing that you and I had discussed, I had asked you, well, do subscribers really pay attention to the letters to the editor?
They do. We have known for many years that the letters to the editor are always in about the top 5 things that readers look for. And we used to do these things, we don't do them anymore, that were eye scanning studies where they would actually put a newspaper in front of people and watch the pages they turn to and even look to the things on the page they look to. But the letters to the editor have always been in the top things that newspaper readers look to.
And I know a lot of the people on our call, well, at least I know several of them, have submitted to you letters to the editor. Some of us have had some printed and some of us had had some turned down. So can you tell us, what do you look for when you decide whether or not you're going to print a letter?
I tell you what, it's it's a big job.
Pressure's on, Derek. Give us the magic. Give us the magic formula here.
Let me tell you, first of all, just what the job entails. There is a special inbox. If you submit a letter, you go to our submission form on the website, and all of those go into a certain place. And first of all, let me address one thing that you and I, Janet, talked about yesterday: the subject line. The subject line is a general indication to me of what it's about. It is not what I print in the paper ever, almost never. I'm not sure I've ever once used the same subject line that the submitter has put in as to what I have included in the subhead, as we call it.
And that's really the title, just
right.
To be clear, right?
And it's to tell me what to look for. The first thing that I look at when I go to that inbox, and by the way, the general ratio of what I receive to what I print, it's between 1 in 8 and 1 in 40. It really sort of depends on the time of year. When we were leading up to the election in November, I bet it was probably 1 in 100 that I had space to print. So the first thing I do is I look at the subject line. And I'm going to be very honest with you. If the subject line right now is Trump, or the subject line is, deficit, something like that, that's a federal issue, that is going to be one of the last ones that I'm going to open. If you have a subject line that's something like Lee Summit Schools, Johnson County polls, something like that, that's going to be one of the first things I'm going to look at, because I'm just simply more interested in local topics. Wyandotte County prosecutor, something like that. Then I will open it up. Also, non-political. I love non-political topics. Something about, like, I've got one today about the prices that are tacked on when you buy a Royals ticket. That is something that is extraordinarily interesting to me, and is of more interest to readers. They're curious about those types of things, because a relatively small percentage of our readers really care about the minutiae of politics. They're interested in things like getting their kids lunches, getting a ticket to a Royals game. Those are the sorts of things that people like to read about. So I look for interesting local topics first as the subject. Then I get into it, and I will read through just to see whether the letter makes any sense. There are times when, I'll be honest with you, I've got a topic that is local, I've got a point of view that is interesting, but that is poorly written. And if that happens, there are many times that I will essentially rework a letter, sometimes very substantially, to just make logical sense and to be grammatically scannable and usable in the paper. And sometimes I will do a lot of rewriting on a letter. There's one, I'm not going to tell you who it is, coming in the next few days, where, you know, it was somebody who did not write well, but had a great point of view. Just because somebody is not that good with writing something down doesn't mean they don't have something to say. And not everybody is a professional writer, not everybody's a good writer. That doesn't make any difference. I really feel like it's important to try to help people articulate themselves well. I think that a lot of us who work in arts and letters sometimes place an undue emphasis on the mechanics of good writing, when, you know, just because I can't articulate myself well does not mean that I don't have something to say. And so I like to try to help people out sometimes who aren't that good with the written word in getting their point of view across.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, no, I you know, sometimes I think that we forget, we place undue emphasis on communication skills sometimes, because somebody who broadcasts or writes for a living is good at something doesn't mean they have something to say. You know, there's one, we pay for a lot of syndicated columnists right now, and there is one syndicated columnist that I have a hard time with, because I pay for this person and he or she, I'm being very cagey here, might be good with putting words together, but the points that this person makes are garbage. And just because the columns are cogently written does not mean that they are valid. And so I struggle, because this person has a point of view that is somewhat popular, but is virtually never responsible to publish. And so I do not put this person's columns in the paper very often, because I find them so morally and intellectually dishonest, but they're well presented. So that's a roundabout way of saying sometimes you can be skillful in what you write and have very little intellectually behind it.
Mhm. Speaking of that, we had a question earlier about how do you fact checking in the realm of it's an opinion piece.
Yeah.
So it's your opinion. You had some really interesting things to say about the whole process of fact checking.
Yeah. You know, the old statement that everybody's entitled to their opinions, but not to their own set of facts. So the difference between opinion and fact is actually, to me, fairly binary, fairly yes or no. The number of people who attend a game, the number of dollars of tax revenue, these types of things are fairly yes or no binary facts. But when it comes down to questions of things where there are shades of gray, everybody is entitled to their own interpretations there. The problem is that in the age of the internet, you can find facts online that, you know, buttress your point of view. And so winnowing out the things that are binary yes or no options sometimes is a little bit murky, because there are people these days, and those of you who work in the political world realize this, whose main job it is to try to obfuscate facts on the internet. And so I've always relied on a lot of the traditional tools of journalism. One of the problems with the open internet is things such as, particularly Wikipedia, are tools that are played by political actors for their own good. And the biggest strength to Wikipedia is its accessibility, is also its biggest liability. It just drives me nuts that people don't understand that, for example, a public figure who has a Wikipedia entry, that person monitors his or her Wikipedia page to try to alter it for their personal good. And I'm going to give you an anecdote here. One of my best friends used to work for one of the big Hollywood management agencies, who worked for, in particular, musical groups. And at the time, she was employed to manage the reputation of one of these big boy bands back in the late 90s, early aughts. And I'm going to try to make this as fuzzy as I can, not to out who this person is. But one of the big boy bands of the late 90s, early aughts had a member who was significantly older than he pretended to be, like by about 7 years. And so this person had public records that were available in the state that he was born in. And if people did enough searching, they could find out he was born in 1967, I think it was, and he claimed to have been born in 1975. And so this friend of mine's job was to police Wikipedia and IMDb and these different places to try to change his birth date to be the younger birth date. And finally, this person has given it up and just admits to the age that he was. But back then, she used to spend like 20 hours a week trying to keep this band's fans from realizing that this person was younger than he was. Now, for those of us in journalism, this is so ridiculous. You know, it's just not something that we would ever, in my line of work, even entertain. If the PR people come to us all the time trying to help us sort of muddy the waters for entertainment figures, and we just don't play that game. And it's really difficult to make people understand that those of us who are in mainstream journalism just don't lie. You know, this is our bread and butter. Our reputation is completely based on the fact that we do our very best not to lie. We do our very best not to let bad information get out there. And if you are somebody who is, for example, like my friend was, an agent representing an entertainer, your job is to try to make your client look the best they possibly can. That is the diametric opposite of what we do in journalism. And it's baked into our DNA. Unfortunately, there's a big world out there that is, you've heard the term infotainment, obviously, that is devoted to trying to make people who are in the public eye look as good as they possibly can. We're not there to try to make them look good or bad. We're trying to make them look as real as possible. And this is the problem when it comes to politicians, because there are some politicians, and I'm not going to name any names, who are very much in it for their personal aggrandizement. And there are politicians who are very much in it to be public servants. And I know exactly who these folks are for the most part, because I've been working with them for a long time. There's a lot of very good public servants out there. And I could name a number of people who I really believe are trying to make the world better. And that's why they get into politics. But then there are also people who are out there because they're trying to get famous on TV. Mm-hmm. And, you know, generally those of us who work with politicians, we can sniff those folks out within the first 20 minutes of talking to them. And we just try to do the best that we can to represent what they're saying to us, but also not letting them lie. And when it comes down to putting them into the opinion section, that kind of gets to your question of what is true and what is false. I publish guest commentaries all the time, and there are certain ones that I will turn away because they simply aren't supportable. There's one that came into me from a member of the U.S. Congress from Missouri or Kansas. I'm not going to say who this is, who recently tried to get a guest commentary published that was just fake. It was false. It was based on a false premise. It was using talking points that had no basis in reality. And even though it was from a U.S. Congress member, I simply was not going to publish it because it was not supportable by the facts. At the same time, there are times when I will get something that I know is basically disingenuous, but it is not using false facts. And so even though I don't really believe the premise is based on good faith, I can't turn it away because it's lying. And you have to hope that readers are savvy enough to understand that where it's coming from it is not exactly on the up and up, but they're not lying in the facts that they're using. And so I will sometimes publish those things.
So a couple of takeaways from that for those of us who are submitting letters to the editor. Don't rely on Wikipedia as a source.
Please don't give me something different from that I can verify. Yes.
And for those of us that like to do research, we can all Google boy band members born in 70, whatever it was, and come up with an answer there. So we have another question. How do you determine the mix of letters that represent Missouri and Kansas and rural and urban?
Well, the mix tends to sort of almost sort itself out as far as Kansas and Missouri for whatever reason. I don't know why that is, but I think that we just have a readership that is from both states enough that I don't even really think about that all that much. I will be honest with you that I give a little bit more weight to rural writers most of the time, just because the vast majority of the people who write to me are from Kansas City or Johnson County. And so when I've got somebody who's particularly writing about like an agricultural issue or a small town issue, I'm just more interested in getting their voices into the paper because they're underrepresented, because those folks, they don't have as much access to getting their voices out there, particularly as community newspapers have so greatly suffered from Facebook just completely consuming all advertising from those small communities and putting so many of those newspapers out of business. So I feel like I have a sort of a responsibility to try to get those voices a little bit wider reach than they would have. I come from rural Missouri. I was born in Mexico, Missouri. My mom was from Mexico, Missouri. My dad was from Paris, Missouri, and I've got very strong connections to those tiny rural communities. And what Facebook and Google have done to the media advertising world and to just obliterating those small communities' interests is going to be something that social scientists are going to look at, I hope, when we have a handle on this. And it's going to be 20, 30 years until we really have come to terms with what Google and Facebook have done. But it's been a terrible thing for those small communities. And again, when I talk about how the national conversation has sort of consumed the local conversation, that happens on a micro level as well. What happens in Monroe County, where I'm from, up there in northeastern Missouri, and how those folks have so little voice compared to what's going on in Jefferson City, and then what Jefferson City has so little voice compared to what goes on at the national level. These are the types of things that 50 years ago were not as much of an issue. And a lot of that is CNN and Fox News turning everything into a Republican versus Democrat issue, which is not the reality of how people live their everyday lives. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I think what League of Women Voters does is so crucial. And I think it's going to become more crucial as we get going forward, because there are politicians who are trying to make the Overland Park City Council, the independent city council, a Republican versus Democrat. You're either a liberal or a conservative on every issue. And that's very reductive, and that's very damaging to democracy. And so one of the things that I would love to do is to try to make people understand that facts are black and white. Facts are yes and no. However, when it comes down to civic issues, everything does not have to be Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal. And I would love to try to diversify our conversations, particularly on the civic issues that affect us on our everyday lives.
I'm going to give a shout out to Nancy Allen, who's on the call. She covers the Overland Park City Council. She covers all the meetings as an observer to share information with all of us. So take note, Nancy. Another question I had was, how do you know when you're submitting to you if you should write a 200-word piece or should you make it a 600-word piece?
I'm just going to tell you from the basic level of your mathematical odds, I have very few slots for 600-word pieces for those op-eds, for those guest commentaries. But again, I've got, between 4 to 7 letters of 200 words that I can write every day. Almost always, any thought that can be expressed at 600 words can be expressed at 200 words, and most thoughts can be expressed at 200 words can be expressed at 100 words. I would way rather get, 7 or 8 100-word letters into the paper than 3 or 4 200-word letters. And I would love to get as many letters as I can in, whereas when something rises to the level of 600-word commentary, it's got to be of interest and it's got to be applicable to a lot of people. So, I've gone through a real reckoning since I've been on the editorial board. I've been working with the letters because I was public editor for many years. I've been working with letters for almost 20 years. And I've been helping funnel guest commentaries to the paper. We used to, before we could see what people were reading with our internet metrics, we used to just sort of put things out there and hope they found an audience. But in particular, once I came to the editorial board in late 2016, I guess it was, I've really refocused my efforts on making things matter. And in particular, it used to be that, in years past, if you remember, we used to have Midwest Voices and all sorts of community commentators who would hold forth on national, international topics. But at the end of the day, that is nothing that we can't get elsewhere. And so if you're going to be writing a guest commentary for me these days, it has to be about Kansas, Missouri, or Kansas City. And it has to be of something that's of great interest. I remember with chagrin now that I ran a guest commentary several years ago from a guy who was very passionate about radio-controlled toy aircraft, basically drones and planes and stuff like that. It was interesting. It was very well written. But then I went and I looked up the organization that he was writing about, or that he was writing on behalf of, what their membership was. And they have something like 75 members who are part of this organization. And in particular, the people they had in Kansas City, I think, was 4 people. And so I'm thinking, why on earth did I take my readership's time, to be honest, by putting this commentary in the paper when it's something that, proportionally very few people care about? And so what I want to do now is to not show disrespect to my readers by taking up real estate and time in their heads on something that doesn't really touch a lot of people. So in other words, a lot of people care about childcare. A lot of people, everybody cares about healthcare. So in particular, what is childcare in Kansas City, and who cares about that, and how is this going to affect the most number of people? Those are the things that I care about the most in picking the letters and the commentaries that I'm going to run.
Thank you. And it's really clear, Derek, that you take your job seriously and that you're valuing and honor the readership because you're trying to serve us. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks. No, I don't want to waste people's time.
That's wonderful. Marcia, do we have any hands raised that I can't see?
Not at this time. I've been looking, but nobody's ventured their hand up yet.
Okay, well, I do have some more questions in chat. Leslie had a comment, and Leslie, do you want to ask the question, or do you want me to read your comment?
Well, I had 2, so
Okay.
you got to tell me which you're interested in.
One about the state legislators.
Okay, well, so happy to. So I was just going to push back, Derek, a little bit about the state legislature being the least covered or understood, although it definitely is, top running there. But even below that falls the actual running of government, and so maligned is governance, right, since Reagan days, that we don't think about it. And our last guest at the League of Women Voters Johnson County meeting is the current Secretary of Administration in Governor Kelly's executive branch. And anyone listening to Dr. Burns-Wallace would know that government is actually in very good hands. So often newspapers fall, and certainly the letters often fall to pointing out the greatest abject failures like Kansas foster care. But rarely do we offer readers an opportunity, or can we ourselves even find a way into the civil servant that class that is actually working extremely well. I can't give you as many examples maybe on the Missouri side, and it doesn't look good from the outside in, but people might say that about Kansas.
Leslie, let me tell you what, that is a fantastic point. And I think, and I'm going to sound a little partisan here, and I am a little, I have a strong opinion about this. There has been a campaign from people who, quite frankly, have a financial stake in getting the government out of regulation as much as possible, very sustained for the past 40 years, to try to denigrate government at every level. And that is absolutely true. And in Kansas, we in particular have the Kochs who have been at the forefront of that. And I think that we need to be honest about the fact that rich people are trying to destroy government as much as they can. And that is simply a fact. I think that part of that, many of you may have seen actually that the head of that enterprise, Mr. Koch, said after the election that, hey, maybe this partisan thing was a little bit of a mistake. And I am personally interested in trying to perhaps engage him and his many tentacles in trying to explore that over the next year. And I think this is something that the Star and the Wichita Eagle, who's our sister paper in the McClatchy group, may be able to engage the Kochs with, to try to figure out the ways that this partisan dismantling of our government may have been a mistake. One of the things that I think we need to really sort of grapple with is the idea that government interference versus government organization has been, I think, largely misrepresented by a lot of folks. And I think that part of the way that Donald Trump was able to harness this populist uprising that he did is that there are a lot of people out there who feel marginalized by their government, who don't understand how many civil servants there are, as you point out, Leslie, keep the wheels turning. And by this just sort of umbrella, all government is bad mantra that we've been hearing so much for the past 40 years, we have devalued the role that government plays in keeping our trash picked up, in keeping our roads paved, in
mental health services.
Mental health services. That's right. If people understood the work that social workers do in keeping families at risk together, these poor folks who have not, who have been failed by their own parents, who then social workers keep together. Gosh, you talk about the foster system. If people understood the odds that people who work in the foster care system are up against, and just what they're able to do in the face of the fact that these bureaucrats are always trying to cut their budgets and to keep them out, the benefits that has down the road in keeping people out of the criminal justice system. It's just such an interconnected group of systems that we have just come to expect that in a liberal democracy, the government is going to play a role in. And so, yeah, it's a great point that in this sustained system of trying to keep the government out of people's business, I understand why they want that. But journalists need to make people aware of all the many different ways that the government that your taxes pay for is helping you out. It's very important. And so I am personally aware of sort of the behind the scenes disinformation campaign that has been played for many years. And I don't want to give an undue voice to that in the letters and commentaries that I publish. But I've always been aware of it, and I'm increasingly aware of it in this day and age. So it's a great point, Leslie.
Thank you both. I've got a couple more questions that came in. So Derek, if you got 2 or more letters on the same subject, how do you determine which one you're going to go with?
That's it comes down to who says it better. And generally, if I've got 2 letters to the editor that basically make the same point, and one of them's 200 words, the other one's 75 words, I'm going to take the 75 word one because that means I get to get somebody else's point in. So, you know, I hear people say all the time, they send me a guest commentary and I say, I don't have a place for this as a commentary, but I can do it as a letter. And they say, oh, I can't possibly do it in 200 words or fewer. And yeah, you can. There's almost no point that can't be made in 200 words. And as an example of that is 3 days a week, I run what's called a short take in print, which you might have noticed. It's on the op-ed page, lower left-hand corner. It's about 220 words. That is virtually always a commentary column or an editorial that I've taken from another source. Generally, they are about 800 words, and I get them down to 200 words. I can name maybe 15 times that I have taken one of those and I thought, oh, I don't have room for this as a full column. I'm going to make it into a short take. And, you know, there have been maybe 15 times over the past 5 years that I decided, no, I can't really distill that down to 220 words. But almost always, hundreds of them, I can take 800 words and turn them into 220. You can do it. You just have to realize what your essence is. And the best example of that I can imagine is my editor now, Melinda Henneberger, who's vice president for the editorial page. I wrote an editorial over this past weekend that started out really, really big and it ended up really, really short. And at first when I read it, I thought, oh, where did those words go? And then I realized, oh, wait, she really got it down to the essence. And yeah, it's better at this length than it was at the version that I filed. Melinda is an absolute master at cutting to the chase, of getting rid of the chaff and just ending up with something that makes more sense at the length that it's at. So she's been a great teacher to me. And my previous boss too, Colleen McCain Nelson, you folks may have been familiar with her work, but she was my previous boss, our previous editorial page editor, was very good at realizing, you know, what length something should be. And almost always the answer is shorter.
Some of us on the call have been the recipients of your dreaded email that says, cut it down to 200 words and I'll publish it.
I'm sorry, I'm probably.
And we have. We have someone on our call from Wuhan, China. And I know you had published a wonderful letter to the editor from someone with a Muslim background that in Overland Park is always asked, where are you from? How would you like someone from other countries that keep running into these obstacles? What approach would you like them to take as they tell their story?
Do you mean just from geographically trying to get into my pages?
Yes.
Being from else? You know, the main thing I would say is it just has to be applicable to Kansas City readers. Again, I know I say this time and again, but there are tons of different ways in the internet age that somebody who's from Rochester, New York can get their voice out there. But why should I care basically what somebody from Rochester, New York thinks about Joe Biden? What I care about is what somebody from Wuhan, China thinks about Quentin Lucas. That I'm very interested in. I ran all sorts of letters at the time of the Super Bowl from people from outside Kansas City who were talking about the Super Bowl as it applies to the Chiefs. But if the Chiefs aren't in the Super Bowl next year, I don't care what somebody from Tampa, Florida says about next year's Super Bowl if the Chiefs aren't playing it. I do definitely care what somebody from Sacramento, California thinks about Patrick Mahomes.
Okay. Juliet, did I represent that question well?
I think so. Unfortunately, I lived in Chicago for many years, so I'm new to Kansas City, so area. So yeah, I totally understand what your hyper local approach and make total sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juliet.
Thank you.
Another question, the league is working really hard on redistricting. And with the census being late and all of the mess that's there, we haven't seen a lot in the letters to the editor about redistricting. Are you open to covering some more information about that?
Yeah, I tell you what, that's one of the things that I struggle with the most, because quite honestly, that is so arcane to so many people. So many folks don't understand that. And when people don't understand it, they don't write about it. I would love, by the way, people on this call, if you've got some good points of view on that, send me some stuff. I just haven't gotten anything on it that makes any
Okay.
sense. Yeah,
Okay.
I would love every person on this call to send me a good letter about redistricting, because it's so important to people. But this is one of those places, again, where those bad actors in government work behind the scenes because they know people don't understand this kind of stuff, and they can have a huge impact on people's everyday lives, but they don't understand it until they realize that, hold on, I don't have anybody in Congress who represents my point of view. And it's because you didn't understand how redistricting worked. And all of a sudden they've gerrymandered themselves out of a voice.
Right. We're really committed to bringing the message of redistricting and what it means to everybody to the attention of the general public, because we believe too that people don't understand the dire consequences. So we're going to take you up on your offer to swamp you with wonderful letters about redistricting.
I heard the
would love
floodgates just open.
that.
Yes.
Great.
People are leaving the calls so they can start writing their letters right now.
And I'll tell you, I have not done my Sunday letters yet. And it's the Sundays letters are the most read of the week. And please get them in there. I'd love to publish them.
I got one letter in the Sunday edition one time.
Excellent.
All right.
It was pretty exciting. So another question we have is, let's see. You had mentioned, we wanted to go back to what you look for specifically in a letter. And I know you talked about local, hyperlocal, coherent, but what are some other concrete tips or rules you could give us that's going to make, we're going to send you a letter and we know we've covered all the bases?
You know, and this is something I was the ombudsman for a long time, for 14 years. As a matter of fact, I think when I left it, I was the longest serving American ombudsman.
Will you tell us what that, I looked it up, but will you tell the rest what that is?
An ombudsman, I started out being the reader's representative, ended up being the public editor, just for different titles for the same thing. But what I was doing is I was writing columns that were representing basically reader pushback against the news. And during that time, that essentially means that everybody thought that I was a partisan Republican, which is funny because I'm not a partisan Republican. I'm not partisan at all. However, it was essentially representing readers taking exception to what the Star was publishing. And so I was putting forth what I thought were responsible criticisms of what we did. But in general, in those days and today, what I always said was there are many things that are very commonly, many opinions that are commonly expressed that are at the end of the day pretty banal, that are not that interesting because they're so common. What I look for is people who are able to give me a point of view that is surprising in some way, amusing, trenchant, whatever it is. But usually the things that are the most interesting are the things that are the most unusual. And so I'm always looking for somebody who's putting forth a take that is going to in some way pique my interest because I hadn't thought of that before. Puppies are cute. Yes, puppies are cute. But if you were to maybe bring out the dark side of puppies, that would be something that I would be interested in. Just because we want to make people think. And if you've got a take on something that surprises me, that's going to go to the top of the heap. Okay.
Amber can send you an article about the dark side of puppies. She's been breaking one in for a little while here. Another question, we just did a program on the need for juvenile justice reform. Have you received a lot? I don't recall reading a lot in the editorial section about that.
I tell you what, this, again, talking about the dark side, we have very, very explicit reader metrics these days. We can tell what people care about and what they don't care about. And the justice system is just something that is so hard to get people to care about. The public defenders systems, by the way, there's good news on the public defender front, which you're going to read about soon in Kansas. But getting people to care about our woefully underfunded public defender system is very difficult. Getting people to care about prison reform, the terrible, terrible things that have happened to people who've been unjustly convicted. People just don't read it. And that is terrible for us as journalists, because we know there is no greater personal tragedy. The worst thing I can possibly imagine is being sentenced to prison for a murder you didn't commit. Something that happened to Lamont McIntyre, that happened to Pete Coons. But for the most part, readers just don't care about it, because unfortunately, a very popular conception is that, well, we ought to lock them up and throw away the key, is the way people care about basically crime stories. And the fact of the matter is that we have seen untold numbers of people who are unjustly convicted through the years, but because each individual story is a small thing unto itself, and also because most people who are in the criminal justice system are criminals, getting people to care about the unjust convictions is difficult. And
So
I tell you,
Derek,
yeah.
I'm sorry, you mentioned a list of things that people don't care about. What are a list of topics that resonate with people and that we should direct letters to?
The things that people care about sometimes are not the most important. Sports, they care a lot about sports. They care a lot about restaurants. They care a lot about, again, I talked about puppies. One of my favorite quotes ever from one of my longtime colleagues, Daryl Levings. People, you might remember Daryl Levings, who's a longtime editor at the Star. Is we had gotten in the most recent list of popular stories on the website, and it was in a time when there was really intense local news happening, and the number one story was about a cat that had gotten trapped inside a pizza box. And it's just the dumbest story in the world. But Daryl just lost his mind about this story about a cat in a pizza box. It was a nothing. This cat was not in peril. It was just kind of a funny story. It was the number one driver of traffic on the website for like a week. And that's the thing that drives us nuts, is that sometimes the things that are the most trivial get the most reader engagement. And so actually, I kind of see it as one of my jobs as an editor is not to give undue influence into that kind of thing, and not to amplify the fact that the BuzzFeeds of the world, YouTube in particular, and TikTok, make all their money by elevating dumb stuff, and sometimes it is impressive. Like, particularly if you see the stuff that trends on TikTok, sometimes it is like people who have these amazing feats of athleticism and, really interesting things. But also sometimes it's just because it's somebody who's really good looking, who's doing a dance, that people want to watch. That isn't news. That's not important at all. So I kind of feel like it's my charge to try to put together a combination of what's interesting, what's also important.
Okay. So the League has a list of things that we work on and we consider important and issues that we've studied. So we would probably, many of us on this call would focus on that. Yeah. I do have a question. Where do you think in the world of journalism, the Beacon, the Missouri Independent, or the Kansas Reflectors, do you think they are doing a good job educating people about difficult subjects?
Oh yeah, I do. And the Reflector, by the way, I should mention, is a partner with the Star, and I have access to run some of the Reflector's content, which I like to try to do. I think that we're going to see a realignment in how journalism works. And this is just my personal view. I think there's going to be some kind of a path forward that I think journalism needs to separate itself from Google and Facebook in some way. And I don't have a crystal ball. I don't see what that future is. But I do think that we are starting to sort of slowly see people sort themselves into believing all the garbage you see on Twitter and Facebook versus what real journalism is. And I hope we're going to get to a point where there's going to be some way to fund actual journalism that people will understand this is not funded by the people who have a vested interest in it versus all that garbage on Wikipedia and Twitter from basically the people who are trying to sell you a product and or trying to buy a politician. So this maybe is pie in the sky, but wouldn't it be a great thing if we had a politics system that had no money in it? And so where it was illegal for a politician to be taking money from anybody, and it was illegal for journalists to be taking money from advertisers, and we just had these pure information systems. That's not the model we have right now.
Right.
The great thing about newspapers is it used to be, when I got into this business 25 years ago, is we had huge profit margins, and the money from advertisers was unimportant to us, because we just had these unquestionable motives that we could just tell the truth, because basically the money didn't matter to us. And I'm not at all saying that money from advertisers matters to us today, because it doesn't. And I will tell you right now that if our president of the paper came into the newsroom and told us, you're going to write this because this advertiser told us, I'm telling you right now, every journalist in the room would resign, because we just simply aren't going to do that. But it used to be unquestioned, because we didn't even have to think about that kind of thing in the past. And the path forward just has to be with getting the money out of the informational systems. I hope the internet's going to enable that to happen, because we're still in the very early ages of the internet. And I don't think people realize that, but one of my best friends is a very senior intellectual property attorney with Microsoft. And believe me, the tech companies are thinking way past this, and they are doing everything they can to try to get the influence of money out of the internet and out of what people get filtered down to them. So I think we're going to see some major revolutions as far as that goes. But I see my value right now is in trying to make sure that I don't allow those moneyed interests to influence the discussion too much. That being said, I also know that think tanks are out there to try to get their opinions in front of readers' eyes. And I realize that that's behind, 80% of what I get.
Well, we're up on the hour here, Derek, and I just want to thank you so much. You've answered every question that's come in, given us a lot to think about. Thank you for caring about us as readers. Thank you for your commitment to integrity in the newsroom, into journalism, and we just really appreciate your time. So a round of applause, everybody. Derek Donovan, community editor. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and I sure wish everybody in the world was a civic-minded person like the League's members. But you all are the ones who are really driving the bus. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We're going to quote you on that too, okay?
Yes, thanks for all you do, Derek, and thanks for taking your lunch hour to be with us. So I hope you get a real lunch hour after this, and we sincerely appreciate all that you're doing and for being here.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Before we close, I just want to remind everyone that we have our next event is Saturday, June 5th. We're going to have the new Wyandotte and the new Johnson County election commissioners together. So we'll talk to them. And now we have a lot to talk about given the week at the legislature. And also just know that these programs are possible because of the support of our members. So if you're interested in joining, please reach out to us on our website, LWVJoCo.org. And that's it. Thanks so much. I'll send out a survey in the next day or two to hear what you thought and what we could do next. So thanks again for being here. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Derek.